You may have thought it impossible for Iowa to ever form a elite wide receiver core. We addressed that position last week. We will delve into the history books and address the other end of the connection. Quarterback under the Kirk Ferentz era. Looking forward to this conversation right here at Hawkeyes Live, right here at the Voice of College Football. Of course, next to me for a 149th time. So I guess we've got a bit of a celebratory show for next week. Corey Brada from the Hawkeye of the Storm. Of course, head on over there. Check out Corey's work every day covering the Hawkeyes. Hey, Corey, how are you?
Good. I'm doing good. I said to my followers yesterday, I've not had a lot of content on the show over the last couple of weeks. Yeah, it's the off season, but I'm also kind of making some adjustments with my studio like you did recently. Not the same nature as you, but we'll get some new equipment in here very soon. And yeah, it's been pretty quiet news front. I mean, that's pretty typical, I guess, for early June. Things are going to ramp up here pretty fast. We got the news on Pat Anger taking over for Eddie Podolak up in the booth with Gary Dolphin. So that was cool for a guy who definitely bleeds the black and gold. And yeah, I mean, we're going to talk quarterback play, which is, I just thought it was just a natural thing to do. We talked all-time wide receivers under Kirk last week. To jump to quarterback play, two positions of struggle. It should give people some confidence that yes, Iowa can strike gold at those two positions. Maybe it happens less than any other position at Iowa, but it does happen, and it has happened. So maybe Tim Lester makes that happen this year.
Yeah. So before we move on to our topic of the day with the Pat Anger announcement. You had mentioned it to me. I saw it just here in the last half hour, and I got to admit, as I did to Corey, I thought, Pat Anger. I know that name. Why do I know that name? And it just goes to show you that my memory is not what it used to be, because I certainly watched him play a lot of football, both at the collegiate and the NFL levels.
Yeah, he was phenomenal as a player. I mean, I said yesterday, I'm recording a brief segment on the news that he was just a part of like the golden years for me of watching Iowa football. Like I said before, I think I mentioned it last week with some of those receivers. We talked about McNutt and DJK. Anger was a part of those teams too, a big part of those teams. Really didn't burst onto the scene, I think, until 2008, and was phenomenal in the league. He actually led the Colts in tackles, I believe, in 2011. And I mentioned he just struggled with injury, and sometimes the injury bug hits the best players. And he was a really good football player at that level. He's been in Eastern Iowa working finances for several years, as a frequent podcaster. So, he's comfortable in front of a microphone. I know he fit the bill as it relates to what Gary Dolphin had stated a couple of weeks ago, that he preferred to have somebody on the defensive side of the ball from the Kirk Ferentz era. That was Gary's preference. And even though Gary, I don't think, deserved to make the decision, my guess has had some influence there. Ed Podolak was not from the Kirk era, was on the offensive side of the football. Obviously, Iowa's calling card is defense, so it would make sense to a large extent to get somebody in there like Pat. And so I'm happy for him, happy for his family. He's got three little ones, and I don't know how that will affect his day-to-day job. I'd love to get him on the show. I'll have to invite him at some point. I have not had him on the podcast, but that was also a loaded draft class. I reflected on that yesterday, Mark, the 2010 draft class for Iowa. Let's see if I can get everybody right. So Brian Bulaga was a first-round draft pick. You had Anger was a second-round draft pick. Amari Spivey was an early third-round draft pick. Kyle Callaway got drafted that year as well. And I know Moiaki, I believe, was a fourth or fifth round draft pick at tight end, who also struggled with injuries in the league. I might be missing somebody. That's a loaded draft class, a really talented team in 2009. They were a talented team in 2010, Mark. Remember, they were the darling in the Big Ten for a lot of people, and didn't quite meet expectations, although had a heck of an effort to get in a place to maybe have a chance late. I think that was the Ohio State game, the Terrell Pryor game, I think. Unless I'm getting things turned around. I'm pretty sure that was the Terrell Pryor year. So anyways, you know that. AJ Eads, thank you. AJ Eads, was he? Yeah, he wasn't drafted 10, I don't think.
I am scurrying for the list right here.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I might be missing somebody in there. I don't think Dace Richardson. I appreciate Doc P. I don't think Dace was that class either.
AJ Eds.
Eads, that is it. So where
AJ
was he
Eads?
drafted?
He was
You
a
don't
fourth
remember it?
rounder. AJ
All right.
Eads.
I just missed
AJ Eads. Here's somebody else I've forgotten about.
Yeah, AJ Eads. That was a crazy draft class when you think about him being a fourth rounder with all those other guys. Talk about the talent on the 2009 roster. That's why when people ask me, what's your favorite team of your lifetime, or you think the best team, I go back to 2009 every time. To me, there's not really much of a debate between 2009 and 2015. Now, I'm not going to take the outlandish approach that someone like Colin Cowhead does, that, because Iowa had one guy drafted in the 6th round of the 2016 draft, that means the 2015 team was a fraud. That's Colin Cowhead being a cowhead. But 2009 was insane when you think about those guys. And boy, some tragic people. I mean, the guys that we've lost from that team. You talk about Tyler Sash is no longer with us. You talk about Kyle Calloway, who was tragically killed as well. Just very, very sad. And then you see the careers of guys like Darrell Johnson-Koulianos. Maybe that was his fault. His playing career never materialized in the pros, as we talked about last week. Who else was I thinking about? Tony Moyaki struck by the injury bug. Pat Anger struck by the injury bug. It's amazing. Maurice Pavey was a starter for the Lions at cornerback for a while. So, man, it's crazy to think about how talented that class was. And then you have, or that team was, and then you have guys that have had tremendous careers. Brian Bulaga, Adrian Claiborne, Broderick Benz has put together a phenomenal secular career. He worked with, I don't think he's on the Iowa staff, university staff anymore, but has done very well after football. So really, really fun team to reflect on.
Callaway was a 7th rounder in that draft, and 6 total picks for the Hawkeyes in 2010. And, looking at linebacking positions and or statistics, I should say, and the conversation we had a couple months ago when it was released by several services, how well thought of this linebacking core is, and look at Jay Higgins' numbers with 171 tackles last year. So Anger had 145 his senior season. And as you mentioned before we started to record here, 5 interceptions his junior season.
And unless I want to go back for a second to the 2009 team. Unless I'm confusing it, 2009 team was still a Sash Greenwood. I should know this for certain. I'm 99% sure that was a Sash Greenwood led safety room. And Greenwood is another. He's still with us, thankfully, but perfect segue to Pat Anger, because Brett Greenwood, I know College Game Day did a special on that years ago. Outside the Lines, at almost the same time, did a special on the Tyler Sash story. But Brett Greenwood collapsing during a workout for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Pat Anger has been along his side in his recovery and therapy process. If you missed that, I go on YouTube and look up Brett Greenwood ESPN, and you'll find the College Game Day special. It will touch you. And Kirk Ferentz was a part of that. Back in 2015, I had the privilege of being at that Iowa-Pittsburgh game. And ironically enough, that was a game where Marshall Kane hits a 57-yard field goal to keep Iowa's unbeaten start alive. Of course, they'd go on to go 12-0 that year. But before that game, you had the Swarm led by none other than Brett Greenwood with his walker as he took some miracle steps. Doctors didn't think he would ever walk again after his collapse and his I don't remember exactly what it was, something heart related, but Pat Anger has been a really good friend to him, and he's moved back to Eastern Iowa. I remember I did some research before doing that segment yesterday, how much Pat Anger spoke highly of the city of Indianapolis, and yet he moved back to Iowa. He loved his roots in Bettendorf, has been there since, has been a big help to the Greenwood family, and there's going to be a lot of really good, I would think, stories, but also just good vibes in that radio booth with a couple of class act people and Pat Anger and Gary Dolphin. And by the way, yeah, thank you, Doc P. Micah Hyde was also on that team. What a career he's had.
Absolutely. How much do you get to hear the radio broadcast? Because, of course, this is a different era than the era that I grew up in, not necessarily you, but I grew up in, where there was opportune times to catch the radio broadcast because the game simply wasn't on television. And I hit, fortunately for my viewing of college football, hit that wave of basically everything getting to television automatically. But I still remember the days when I'd have to pull up a college football game, an Ohio State game, just because it was on the radio. But because everything's accessible on television and streaming, how often do you get to tune into the radio broadcast and just check it out?
Yeah, not as much as I'd like. I'm not a type of guy, and I'm Gary meant a lot to me. I think I've said this on the air before. Gary meant a lot to me when I was a freshman in high school. He had me up in the booth for a game, a play-by-play game with him and Eddie, and that meant a lot to me as a young kid that wanted to get into something broadcasting related. Had me for a Hawk Talk with Kirk Ferentz at one of the restaurants there in Iowa City. So that stuck with me. I've always appreciated Gary for that, and always a pleasure to see Gary in Iowa City. But I don't listen to it as much anymore. I don't like turn down the radio. I don't know how people do that. How do you turn down the radio? I've never understood that. I always hear people say that because I'm a big Mavs fan. I'm watching the NBA Finals. They're trailing 0-2, but I hear listen to this podcast with the Mavs radio guy. And he's always like, well, if you don't want to listen to the TV guys, just turn on the TV. How do you sync that, Mark? How do you sync it? Somebody just explain to me how you sync it. I'd love to do it because
why do you have to sync it?
Who wants to watch a game when you have somebody make a shot and then 10 seconds later you hear the crowd erupt? That doesn't make any sense. I don't like that holistically. I don't like that. So anyways, I don't listen to as much as I do, or as I'd like. I will say this, it's less now that I'm doing a post-game show. I used to listen to the post-game after the broadcast. You're on your way back from a game, or even, the TV broadcast is over. And so you turn up the radio, and now I'm on with Coach Patterson almost immediately. So less and less, but definitely appreciate the legendary names that have graced that booth.
Folks, we appreciate the conversation in the chat. If you got comments or questions, we appreciate your super chat contributions. If you have anything for Corey or myself concerning the Hawkeyes or the Big Ten, as we march on, we released some ACC power rankings earlier this week. We will get to the Big Ten and let you know when we do so and where we've got the Hawkeyes. All right, we will talk quarterbacks here. So starting in 1999, so that was Kirk Ferentz's first season. Of course, it was not a glorious one as he got off to a rough start, but that was fully expected. And I certainly was mighty impressed with the turnaround of this team and this program under Kirk Ferentz the first few seasons. And when we look at the quarterback position over this tenure, and I made my list. Of course, we need to hear from you first and foremost. Of course, there are a few guys that are obvious selections here if we're looking at a top 5 here. But of course, Brad Banks was the first one that really exploded on the national scene under Kirk Ferentz. So how did you determine your top 5 here?
Well, first of all, this is kind of like wide receiver. Like, these are the easier ones to do because the pool is so much smaller. I mean, Brad Banks, obviously a Heisman runner-up, you put him at the top, even though his career was not as long as some other guys. I think there's some debate after that as far as what order you go with from 2 to 4. But I think clearly the next 3 are probably Stanzi. Well, not probably. They are. Stanzi, Tate, Stanley. Again, what order? That's up for debate. I know Stanley's at the top of a lot of the record books as it relates to the Ferentz era. Part of that is longevity. I think team success should be weighed. I've got Stanzi as my number 2 if we're doing this in order. I've got Banks number 1. I've got Stanzi number 2. I'll probably go with Tate number 3, simply because you look at Tate's career, and I think from a success standpoint, no, he never won a Big Ten, never won a BCS bowl, but he did have moments that we look back on, like the Capital One heroic pass to Warren Holloway that you remember. I mean, it's hard between him and Stanley. They're two different guys too. Tate was mobile. Stanley was very much not. But Stanley, I really like Nate Stanley was a gamer. I'm not really looking at statistics too much, but I think those are your clear top four. And then after that, you can go a lot of different places. I would definitely go Beathard at number 5. And then I don't know where you go after that. I'm glad this is just a top 5 because like Vandenberg from a statistics standpoint, you could argue Beathard or Vandenberg, but Vandenberg actually finished with more total yards. The problem with Vandenberg, and their numbers are very similar if you look at them. I know some people would think that I'm wrong on that, but again, go back and look at the numbers. Longevity you give to James Vandenberg. I think the disadvantage Vandenberg had was he played during an era where that offense was just so unproductive, just not a good offense not very conducive to quarterback play and numbers. And so I think Vandenberg gets a bit of a bad rap. But I do think you go Beathard. It has to be in the top 5, even though his career 2016 was not a success and he didn't get the job until 2015. Played through injury a lot of, both years, actually. So, I love CJ. I've said that before, but I don't think you can look past the Heisman runner-up of Brad Banks, the overall team success of Stanley, although I know 2015 was a successful year as it relates to number of wins. Tate, I just think Tate, Stanley, Beathard are very, very close, and even Vandenberg because of his longevity. It just depends on how you're looking at this. So, am I right there, Mark? I probably would give Beathard the nod over Vandenberg just because of team success.
So again, you are going Banks, Tate, Stanzi, Beathard, and Stanley.
I've got Banks, Stanzi. I've got Stanzi second, Tate, Stanley, Beathard. I know some people would put Beathard ahead of Stanley. I've gone back and forth on that.
Okay. I didn't think you ordered them. I thought it was just the top 5. Okay.
Oh, well, if you're asking me order, that'd probably be my order. But no. Okay. Yeah, so, the top 5, and then my honorable mention would be James Vandenberg.
So, of course, Jake Rudock had a nice 2013 and 14 combination there, went to Michigan, but that does not count. We are looking at the numbers of James Vandenberg, and that's a really nice 2011 season, of course, 3,000 yards, 25 touchdown passes. Oh, I don't think there's any. I'm right there with you in regards to those are the 5 that I had, knowing that you have been selecting a top 5 for these 2 weeks. Those were the same 5 I came up with as well.
So you wouldn't have even given Vandenberg a sniff for the top 5?
Not. I think it's notable, but I don't think
I agree.
That it took me no regard
agree.
For a top 5.
I think I'm being maybe a little bit overly sympathetic to him because of the Greg Davis era and what that turned into. Now, CJ was also part of the Greg Davis era, so that is one thing. If you're going to go tiebreaker, you got to give Beathard the tiebreaker because Beathard was more productive with that staff. But I will say Vandenberg was early in that era. So, and as far as NFL success, boy, you can almost flip it, right? Like Beathard is number 1. It's not like any of these guys have had great careers in the NFL, but Beathard would be number 1. Who else has had success in the NFL? Like none of these other guys. I think Stanzi briefly made the Chiefs roster, I think briefly on the Jacksonville roster, but I mean, in general. And by the way, Kelvin Fisher says Stanzi too many pick sixes. I get it. Like the numbers in 2009 weren't great, but the dude produced. Like those were fun teams to watch. Yes, he was graced with better skill position players than some of these other guys. Certainly Beathard in 2016 did not have a receiver with a pulse, it felt like at times, with all due respect to Riley McCarron. And you could say the same thing about Vandenberg. At times, his best receivers were Cavante Martin, Manley, Keenan Davis. So yeah, it's hard. These are so subjective. And again, it's going to be harder. When you start talking about like linebackers, offensive line, you start talking about defensive line, it's going to be harder to end up with just 5.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would settle on Vandenberg's my honorable mention.
Yes, because of the depth of those positions. But these discussions, doing wide receivers last week, doing quarterbacks this week, are more objective because not that the stats do not tell us everything by any stretch. Can't be just a stat nerd and say, okay, the best stats. You're obviously giving it a lot of context, considering offensive line play, wide receiver play or lack thereof, a lot of other conditions, big game performance, team accomplishments, but the numbers generally are 75 or 80% of the story. And
And if that's the case, Mark, like what Eric said in the chat, I'm okay with the argument of Beathard over Stanley. However, there are people that will show you Stanley's numbers. He ended up with the most touchdowns in Iowa history, most passing touchdowns in Iowa history. As far as yardage is concerned, he ended up with the second most yards behind only Heisman runner-up Chuck Long. Those are pretty hard to, again, if we're looking at stats, those are pretty hard to argue.
When you look at the current quarterback situation and understanding that there's really only been one quarterback, and that's Spencer Petras, there is only 1 degree of separation, Spencer Petras being that guy, between the current quarterbacks and Nathan Stanley, and their Nate Stanley through 26 touchdowns, 2 consecutive seasons. Like, he's putting up those kind of numbers. We're only 1 quarterback removed from that type of production. And,
Nate Stanley here's something notable. And I think this is a huge stat to follow. Not everything, but it's a huge stat following into this year. Not 1 year did Nate Stanley hit the 60% mark as it relates to completion percentage. And that's notable because, again, all the stats, and yet his best completion percentage was 59.4 his senior year. So, and again, Mark, go to, you've got it up there. I'll just have you do this if you don't mind. Go to Spencer Petras. You talk about his 3-year career following, right? So Stanley gets 3 years. Petras gets 3 years, one being a truncated 2020 season, but it counts. Or excuse me, I guess, am I right? 3 years. He was done in 22. Look at his numbers. Not 60 yard or 60% number in there for a season. Certainly Deacon Hill was not at 60% last year. And I don't think, even if you want to count Cade McNamara, I don't think that's fair to do that because he played in 3 or 4 games, 5 games. His completion percentage in a short period of time was 51.1%. So I guess keep going back. If you want to talk about full-time starters in recent history for Iowa, go back before Nate Stanley, go back to C.J. Beathard. Beathard in his time at Iowa had 1 year of 60% completion percentage, and that was in that 2015 run. 62% completion percentage. That's got to be the mark, right? Like 2016 was a down year. Shouldn't have been a down year because I thought they retained a lot of that talent. That's evident by the lack of draftees they had in 2016. Brought back Desmond King, brought back Beathard, etc. The last time Iowa's had a passer go for 60% on the season was 9 years ago. That's got to be the goal if you're Tim Lester. And I'd have to go back and compare those stats to what he had, what Lester had at Western Michigan. But I'm guessing he's had 60% passers almost every year, or he had them at Western. I could be wrong on that. We know what he did through the air with some wide receivers. So that's an achievable goal, I think, regardless of who's the quarterback, because I do think it's something he values.
It's a good point, and I'll make another one here, that the descent of those pass completion numbers are at the same time conflicting with what's going on in the rest of college football. At the time that Drew Tate, Ricky Stanzi, those guys were completing 62% of their passes, that was a really good number. It wasn't phenomenal, but it was good. It wasn't average. It was probably better than average. It was those were good numbers to be hitting 60 and then in the low 60 percentile. There are guys all over the place that are in the high 60, 70%, 72%, 74% at a time when Iowa's completion percentage has crashed to around 50% or just above it in recent years, the rest of the nation and the proficiency of the passing game is increasing.
How about Deacon Hill? 49%, Mark. 13 games played, 49%. It's a team that won the Big Ten West. I mean, think about it. So what? Here's a good follow-up question to this discussion, because we're talking about it. What does a 60%, and I'm not saying, again, not implying that it's the end-all stat, but you tell me, Mark, what does, with the guys they have coming back, yeah, the schedule's a little bit more difficult, but not as difficult as it could have been and will be moving forward. The question I have is, what does a 60% passer this year do to the offense and to this team as a whole?
It's huge. It is huge. It doesn't sound like it, but when you go from 48 to 50% range to 60, and you're throwing the ball 22, 24 times a game, something in that range. Most winning games, I would guess, for Iowa against good opponents where they can't just sit on the ball. And I understand that they have been able to do that a few times against some decent opponents like Wisconsin last year. But probably needing to throw the ball 20 to 24 times a game. You go from completing 11 of 24 to more like 15 or 16. It's 4 completions that could be of any variety. It could be a 3-yard completion that doesn't mean much, but they could be over the course of a closely contested football game. They're typically going to be 4 or 5 throws there that make the difference between punting and keeping the ball and advancing the ball, or breaking off for a big play and scoring points. So absolutely. Look at the pass completion percentage last season in college football. Oregon completed 77% of their passes. And we had 6 teams in college football complete over 70% of their passes. And we had 77 teams complete at least 60% of their passes.
So here's
77.
my, Brian Ulrich in the chat. I don't know that I can debate this. I'm not some offensive coordinator and some statistician as it relates to football, but he says rather have 57% on completions with 7.5 yards per attempt than 63% with 6 yards per attempt. My only response, again, without debating it, I'm not saying he's right or wrong. Why not have both? Why not have 63% with 7.5 yards per attempt? Mark, go back and look at those numbers you just showed. There are a lot of teams on that list that had both. Like all those teams that were well over 60% completion. Also, a lot of them, I think all of them that I saw, look at the numbers. I mean, yards per attempt. Is there anybody under 7.5 on there? So, okay, it's a couple of 7.3s in there. Georgia State, Middle Tennessee, but everybody's above that.
Yeah, if you're looking at the power conferences.
I mean, keep going down. How far do we go here, right? Like 7.5 is not some crazy thing to achieve. Most of
Arkansas, 7 point, and they're a bad football team.
Yeah.
Alabama, 9.5. Goodness.
I mean, I'm probably drinking everybody said I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. That's fine. That's fine. I just think these are not big bars to set. And as it relates to the bar that has been set with this offense, that I think makes a lot of people hesitant to reevaluate expectations and put faith in a guy like Tim Lester to not make a 180, but create significant progress in year one. Doc P, what he said back at 5:02 p.m., Mark in the chat, Petrus O-line and OC failed him. Yes and no. I mean, yes, I believe me, I was plenty critical of the offensive line. I was plenty critical of Brian Ferentz, obviously. However, all of it goes hand in hand. And Petrus, let's not act like Petrus was not wanted by a bunch of Power 5 schools when he left Iowa. Mark, he's a 3-year starter. How many 3-year starters at a Power 5 league team that enter the transfer portal don't have Power 5 options? I don't know that he had any Power 5 options. I actually doubt he did. Maybe he did. He goes to Utah State. Now, maybe he'll just light the world on fire. I know he's coming off a serious injury.
Utah Tech.
No, Utah State.
I thought it was Utah Tech. Why did I?
You're thinking of Deacon Hill.
Oh, Deacon Hill. Yes, I
Yeah,
got it
one's at
confused.
Utah State,
I'm
one's at
sorry.
Utah Tech.
Yes.
Formerly Dixie State. So,
Yes.
anyways, my point being, it is a collective effort to be this bad. How many times have we said that on the show? But I would think Tim Lester not only being a better play caller, a better evaluator of quarterback play in practice, a better quarterbacks coach, a guy that's going to probably even help the wide receiver room more than maybe Iowa's last wide receiver coach did. You think about that as a non-wide receivers coach coordinator is pretty incredible to say, but I think it's feasible. All of it makes me think that the room to jump here is significant. Some people say, well, they still don't have the horses. I'm not saying they have the horses that Tim Lester wants. They still have some of the same guys that were, starters with Spencer Petras, and we see that other teams weren't, involved in bidding wars for Spencer Petras or Deacon Hill, but he's going to get more out of them. I think significantly more out of them than you ever saw out of Brian Ferentz. And this is going to sound like I'm being very mean, and I'm not, because it's business, right? It's not got anything to do with personal stuff. But I have as much confidence in Tim Lester to get everything he can out of his guys. And on the flip side, had as much confidence in Brian Ferentz to get as little as possible out of the talent he had, whether the talent was great or not very good. Charlie Jones being a perfect example. We saw it on both ends of the spectrum. Players that aren't real talented, he ain't going to get much out of them. They're not going to become 5-star high draft picks. Like some guys at certain positions, like a Tyler Linderbaum that was probably working with Kirk in addition to whoever was at Barnett. I guess it wasn't Barnett then. Whoever the offensive line coach was at the time, Polasek, you're going to have those diamonds in the rough. But as it relates to quarterback play, it's been nothing but putrid since Brian Ferentz took over. So I expect that to change. Oh, with the exception being Nate Stanley. However, I think it's a fair thing to point out that he did begin his career with Greg Davis. And although I've been critical of Greg Davis for different reasons, I do think Stanley starting out with Greg Davis helped him. And he was a talented guy with some excellent tight ends that fit into the Iowa system. We did not see some monumental progress in his fundamentals or just play as a whole from 2017 until 2019. Mark, I could argue he had his best year in 2017. So that is an indication to me that I'm not giving Brian Ferentz much credit for the Nate Stanley production. Yes, I can't. David says, you just can't stop bashing Petras. I'm just saying he went to Utah State. He is not some victim. I'm so tired of the victim. I'm not saying David's doing that, but I hear so many people that try to make Spencer Petras the victim. As Don Patterson has said dozens and dozens of times on my show, Spencer Petras was part of the problem. Just like Brian Ferentz was part of the problem. Could Petras have been coached better? Yes. But had someone else not been here, had someone other than Brian Ferentz, etc., been coaching that offense at that point, it's either likely that A, they wouldn't have brought him in, or B, they wouldn't have continued starting him year after year after year. So I'm just saying Iowa's last two starting quarterbacks have went on to Utah State and Utah Tech. And the guys who haven't played have went to the likes of, let's see, I can't even think of some of the schools. Deuce Hogan was a walk-on at Kentucky, I don't even know where Deuce Hogan is now. Carson May went to Coffeyville, then transferred to Wyoming. Now I think he's at some other G5 school or I think he went to an FCS school. Alex Padilla got buried on the SMU depth chart. Like they obviously were not recruiting well. All right. They obviously did not recruit well. They didn't develop well, but they obviously did not recruit well either.
By contrast, I was collecting a list while you were going through that because that's a great point. By contrast, Iowa's competition in the Big Ten during the last couple of years. Look at quarterbacks who were decent quarterbacks, who were in the running for a starting position, but maybe somebody else was better. And look at the type of schools they've gone to. Gavin Wimsatt at Rutgers. Couldn't win the job, apparently. He's off to Kentucky.
As a scholarship player.
Oh, absolutely.
Not as a walk-on.
Ethan Kalkumanis. Why he left Minnesota, we don't know. Maybe this incoming guy from New Hampshire's better, but he landed at Rutgers. We also have Michigan State, Peyton Thorne. He leaves Michigan State. Was Peyton Thorne a great quarterback? No, capable quarterback. He goes to Auburn, becomes the starting quarterback at Auburn. I thought of a few other ones along the line. Cade McNamara can't win the starting quarterback at Michigan because they've got a 5-star, but he's able to land at Iowa.
Yeah, he actually he lost the starting position after taking that team to the Big Ten championship in a college football playoff berth. And I appreciate the dialogue from David. He says, I feel bad for the young man. He got sold a bill of goods, could have went somewhere else and done well. So I do appreciate the dialogue, David. I'm not trying to bash you. The problem with that statement is nobody is keeping these. Like, this is the era of the portal. If he wanted out, he could have left. I just think we're playing the kid as a victim. Yeah, okay, if he got sold a bill of goods, first of all, Iowa was, as far as offers, it's not like he had Alabama and Michigan State and all these great places on his offer list. I think he was initially committed to Oregon State before flipping to Iowa. He could have left. At any point in his career, he could have left. Now, I could also say, Mark, why would you leave? When you are the starter in spite of terrible quarterback play year after year after year after year after year, why would you leave? It was his decision not to leave. If he was some talented guy who was sold a bunch of nonsense, Mark, why wouldn't he in 2021 or in 2022 have just said, I'm out. I'm going someplace else. Like, look at this big arm I've got. I'm going to go play someplace that can protect me, give me better skill position players. I'm going to light the world on fire. He didn't do that. I think partially because it's likely Spencer Petras knew, or people around him knew, that was not going to work well. So if he wanted to play Power 5 football, he's going to have to stay at Iowa and be a part of an offense that was bottom barrel of Power 5 football.
Who here thought that Graham Mertz did an outstanding job at Wisconsin?
That's a great example.
And he's the starting quarterback at Florida.
Great example. So maybe, listen, if Petras goes to Utah State, lights the world on fire, I'll give him credit. But it ain't like Graham Mertz going to Florida and doing it. But I don't think Petras is going to go to Utah State and light the world on fire. He does that. I will eat a couple bites of crow. Not completely. I don't think he's going to do that. But it's certainly not going to be, again, Charlie Jones. Go back to some of these other positions. These guys, I know he's an easy one to bring up, but other position guys who weren't really producing. Now, he was a special teams outlier, but he goes on somewhere else and is just a breath of fresh air at a Power 5 school. So anyways, that's my soapbox. I'm glad we're having these conversations. Isaac says that Hogan is now at New Mexico. So there you go. So New Mexico, that is FBS.
Yes.
Oh, good for him. Good for him. I'm assuming he is on scholarship in New Mexico. I would hope that he's on scholarship for New Mexico.
And the last one I'll throw out there, Will Levis could not earn the starting job at Penn State and went to Kentucky. Was a second-round draft pick in the NFL draft.
Now, some of the naysayers there would say Penn State's a different class, but I think the best one you brought up was Graham Mertz, because people associate Iowa oftentimes with Wisconsin. So, and Petras and Mertz, their careers lined up. Remember the game in 2022, the game in Kinnick, and Mertz just looked. Mertz looked worse than Petras in that game. Now, maybe he was dealing with some injury, but it was unbelievable to watch that. How bad he looked. And I thought, there's no way anybody in the Power 5 wants him. He goes to a SEC school with national championship history and plays really well. That really did surprise me. But there are smart people who are working at these universities that are evaluating these kids, because you just went off numbers. You ain't going to get much with Graham Mertz, but the Gators liked him, and good for them.
Graham Mertz, I don't know if this statistic held out, but with a couple games left in the season, and I believe he accomplished this, set an SEC completion percentage record. Completed 74% of his passes.
That's incredible. Shows you I mean, again, it's not as simple as saying, well, he had better skill position talent, but that's probably part of it. Guessing the disparity between skill position talent, specifically wideouts from Wisconsin and Florida, was just so stark. And Isaac made the correction. Apparently, Hogan is at New Mexico State.
Okay,
So,
the Aggies. They've got a good program. Jerry Kill was just there, of course. He retired following.
And they are also
the bowl game.
FBS. They are also FBS. So, yeah.
The 22 Wisconsin game at Kinnick. I'm not coming up with really what kind of game that was. I assume.
What kind of game do you think it was?
Yeah, I'm sure it was played below 415, but it's not coming to mind what kind of, like, I can't really envision
like
anything happening, anything specific.
It's like a couple of overweight children fighting over a little Debbie. Like that's what that game was. Like nobody really ever got off the ground. There was never any like grand prize at the end. It was a couple of, I mean, Iowa did end up, it's amazing that Iowa finished 8-5 that year with the as bad as it was. It could have been worse had they maybe Brian Ferentz, had they lost that game, maybe he would not have been retained. You wonder what would have happened at 6-6 or even 5-7. You wonder if maybe the OC search would have started a year earlier, but we'll never know.
Iowa scored 10 points in the fourth quarter to pull away 24-10.
Yeah, I believe one of them was a pick six by Cooper DeJean. The other one was set up by the other score was set up by Cooper DeJean on a punt return that took him like inside the 20 or inside the 10. I'm just saying that's legitimate. So
that's great. Of course it was. Of course that's what happened.
Yeah.
All right, just to fill in the gaps here in the quarterback tenure under Kirk Ferentz, because I like to do this and because I did do the work here. So it started off with Scott Mullen for 1999 and 2000. Hit on 53%, 2,600 yards, 11 touchdowns, 16 picks. Of course, two pretty bad football teams. Kyle McCann, 98 through 01, 58%, 4,100 yards, 23 TDs, 21 picks. To Banks, Nathan Chandler did some good things, 54%, 2,200 yards, 19 touchdowns, 10 picks in 03. Then Tate, whom we talked about, of course. And Drew Tate, I have fond memories of Drew Tate doing a lot of good things and being a guy that I enjoyed watching play. Jake Christensen, you mentioned him a couple weeks ago for some reason. 06 to 08, 55%, 21 TDs, 9 picks, just under 3,000 yards.
Those stats make it sound better than it was. I remember he didn't finish the 08 season. Stanzi took over for him and led him to a good bowl victory, a blowout victory over South Carolina in the Outback Bowl. And that was a pretty talented 08 team. Yeah, I mean, he was Jake Christensen was like a Brian Ferentz quarterback. Like he was in the wrong era. I don't know how the offensive staff tolerated that as long as they did.
Sean Green had a huge game in the Outback Bowl, correct?
Yeah, man, he had a huge game against Wisconsin that year too. Go back and he had like 4. I saw somebody was at Big Ten Network posted something about Sean Green's game against Wisconsin today. Yeah, he was phenomenal. He isn't being inducted into the Iowa Hawkeyes Sports Hall of Fame, I believe. I saw that a few days ago. Well deserved after winning the Doak Walker Award in 2008. What would have been 2009? You wonder about they went 11-2 in 09, beat Georgia Tech in the Orange Bowl, lost Stanzi, but you just wonder. I mean, it's hard. You can never play that game because all kinds of things could have went differently had he come back. But you lose him, and you got to play a couple of freshmen in Adam Robinson and Brandon Wager. Had Sean Green come back in 2009, I mean, they may not have lost a game. They may have been. What would have happened? If I don't, because that was back during the best BCS era. So you tell me, they beat Northwestern, which they were already up 10-0 in that game. So assuming you have a running game and assuming every other game plays out as it did, assuming you have a run game, you beat Northwestern pretty handily, even without your quarterback and with Sean Green there. And then, I mean, I think, they went to overtime with Ohio State without their quarterback and without a solid running game. So you bring in Sean Green. Okay, say they win that game, they beat Minnesota as they did anyways, and they're 12-0. What happens at that point that year?
That's a great question because the BCS championship game that year was between two undefeated teams. That was a undefeated Alabama team, undefeated Texas team.
So my guess is that Iowa would have went bowling at Pasadena. The problem with that year, and again, we don't know how that would have changed with Sean Green in the mix, but if we're just taking the other games as they were, a lot of close calls. Remember, they almost lost to UNI in week 1. Had 2 block field goals to save that game in Kinnick week 1 against the Panthers of UNI. And I mean, Arkansas State was a struggle at times that year. Blew the doors off Iowa State. Wisconsin was a pretty impressive victory. Beat Michigan under the lights. Pretty impressive there. Needed a last-second pass to Marvin McNutt against Michigan State. Needed a huge comeback at home against a Bill Lynch-coached Indiana Hoosiers team. So they were nicknamed the Cardiac Kids. I remember ESPN coined them that during the season. So, who knows how that would have changed with Sean Green. But had they been 12-0, like say you beat Northwestern, Ohio State, all the other wins are the same, they're probably not beating out an undefeated Alabama and undefeated Texas. But it would have been cool to see them in another Rose Bowl and have a chance at a 13-0 season. And then you talk about the possibility you win the Rose Bowl and there'll be Iowa fans. There would have been Iowa fans that would have forever claimed that as a cheat for Iowa. Should have been in the national title game, but
I would have been right there with them. I would be hanging a banner for Iowa on our collection of as we review all the national championship seasons. Absolutely. There's nothing else they could have done.
Who was that USC or was that Oregon? Who played Ohio State? Oregon.
Ohio State beat Oregon.
And was that was it Thomas? Was that who was
on Oregon? Darian Thomas was the quarterback. No, he was the quarterback. He was the quarterback after. That's a good call, though. Jeremiah Masoli was the quarterback for Oregon in that Rose Bowl.
And Ohio State won that game, didn't they?
Yes. It wasn't any kind of blowout, but they won by 9. They won by 2 scores. It was, they were pretty well in control in the fourth quarter, but it was a decent game. Absolutely. Darn Terrell Pryor. No, that was the next season, 2010.
That was the next season. No, it was that darn what's the kicker's name that made that kick in 2009? We've done this before. We've done this before. I can think of it if you give me a second.
Oh man, I should know it.
Yeah, you should know
other kickers, but I can't.
Devin Barkley. Devin
Barkley. Yeah.
I remember that call from. I got a lot of respect for the bald eagle. What's his face for ESPN, who's been calling games.
Sean
forever.
McDonough.
I got a lot of respect for Sean McDonough, but that was one of the more annoying moments in the history of me watching college sports. And his voice is cracking. He's going nuts over like a 35-yard kick or something, whatever it was.
Well, won the Big Ten championship.
I get it. I know. Had James Vandenberg not went down, stupid sack you take. You never take a sack on third down, right? Especially in overtime on the brink of field goal range or in field goal range. And isn't it ironic Iowa never learned from that? Like, how many times do we see Patriots do that and Deacon Hill do that? Like, unbelievable. But had he not done that, who knows what would have happened even with Vandenberg.
Yes, you have every right to say without your starting quarterback and losing that type of game down to the wire on the road that Iowa, you can't say it because we don't know, but it's logical to say Iowa would have won that game. You would have hated to have heard my impression of that matchup going into both games. I knew it was a big game. It was obviously the standings told me it was a big game, but I didn't think Iowa had a chance to beat Ohio State. I didn't even think about it.
With Stanzi, would you have thought differently? Because they were 1 week removed from losing their first game to Northwestern without him and blowing a 10-point lead. I think that would have changed the narrative had he been healthy.
Sure. I was just being a little cocky and arrogant. That was not.
I get it.
That was not being a broadcaster and approaching the game like I would here. That's me just being a fan And
I don't think many people thought Iowa had much of a chance going into that game. I mean, hey, James Vandenberg had never started. He looked pretty bad at times against Northwestern. I mean, he was just on fire in that game. If you go back and watch it, he was just. There were people comparing the dude to Brett Favre, like the dude. And here's the problem in that game: he couldn't. Again, Iowa hasn't learned from this. He could not take anything off these passes. Like everything was a missile. I remember Trey Strauss dropping 2-3 passes, and yeah, I mean he was so accurate and made so many big plays, but almost the sad irony of that costly mistake in overtime that is sort of screams a young quarterback with inexperience. I mean, think about that, Mike. Can we just think about that moment? Here's a guy that I'd love to get on the show, James Vandenberg, kind of the forgotten guy. Hey, he didn't even make my top 5 today. But you think about James Vandenberg in that moment. Think about what it would have been like coming in, you're 9-0 against Northwestern. First of all, you blow that game, right? At home. At home, you're up 10-0 on the Wildcats, the lowly Wildcats. You blow that game. Everybody's counting you out against Ohio State. And they go play like that in the shoe and come back from 2 touchdowns down in the shoe. I mean, imagine what his pulse would have been like in overtime. It really is incredible. And he didn't look as good against Minnesota the next week. The offense struggled. The defense carried them. But I'll always remember that game as one of the more unbelievable moments where an Iowa offensive player, specifically a quarterback, like stepped up in the moment and just given, relative to the situation, played incredibly well and far exceeded expectations.
Great moments. Absolutely. They were. Appreciate you all being here for Hawkeyes Live right here at the Voice of College Football. We do this with Corey each and every Tuesday night, 5:30 Eastern, 4:30 where it counts. You see on the banner there, it's a big night at the Voice of College Football, Nebraska Live in just a few minutes, 7 p.m. Eastern. The biggest 12 on the Big 12 channel and Michigan Live, 8 o'clock Eastern time. So Iowa fans, get on over to the Michigan channel and Nebraska. Get after those guys. I know that there's nothing necessarily to talk about on the recruiting front right this second, but of course, this is a big time period as we launch into June with camps and official visits. And so we should have quite a bit to discuss in the next 4 to 6 weeks.
I do know Cooper DeJean's in Iowa City today. So if you see Cooper, say hi to him. And I know his younger brother, I believe is Jackson DeJean, got an offer from Iowa here in the last week. So it surprised a lot of people. We saw IOC Epinesa. AJ was also in town to accompany his brother on his official visit. And so he's a highly touted kid, I believe, a 5-star on most sites. He's one that everybody wants. And so they've gotten some kids there. A lot of people have reported, Mark. I mean, I don't know if that's really news we need to cover, but like I think everybody's there by now. If they're not, the clock is ticking. But people I've talked to, I did talk to Xavier Williams. If people are curious about him, there's a running back that has kind of flown under the radar on the 24 front for Iowa's or 23 recruiting, 24 class. I always forget what class we're in because they sign in December now. I talked to him here in the last week, so we'll be publishing an interview with Indiana native Xavier Williams, and more coming as it relates to interviews. But yeah, everybody's there, so they're getting workouts. I've seen the university has posted some videos and some pictures of some summer workouts beginning, and like we keep saying, it'll be here before you know it, and media days will be here before you know it. So what do we want to do next week? We'll see what happens with news. But Mark, is there a position we should move to as far as our top 5? I feel like we should just keep doing. I think we should keep doing offense because, like, we could stay up. We could just forever debate defensive positions. But why don't we move?
Hopefully, we'll get to all of them.
Why don't we move to running back? Because that's probably the third easiest position to do. Not because there hasn't been talented guys, but because there have not been a lot of high-end guys, unlike at Iowa's counterpart, Wisconsin. So we can move to maybe running back next week and come up with the top 5. And go from there, see what news breaks in the next week.
Very good, everyone. From the Hawkeye of the Storm is the place to be each and every day for Hawkeyes coverage. Back here on Tuesday, 4:30 Central, everyone. We're going to leave you, everyone, with a word from our sponsor. Love what I do as a sports commentator. I have definitely been blessed. I enjoy my career. But I got to say, if I could turn back time, I would learn the business side of sports management, how to manage people, how to manage projects, how to manage situations. And then there's also those times in which you feel stuck in a job, stuck in a career, just feeling that there's a dead end and wondering and waiting, when is that break going to happen? Well, unfortunately, I got to tell you, that break is not coming unless you make it happen. Sports is your passion. You love it, you live it, you breathe it. Why not make your passion your career? Introducing Southern New Hampshire University, our sponsor. At SNHU, you will learn the business side of sports, sports management principles, and how to gather and analyze data. This degree will help you prepare for a career as an athletic director, sports information director, marketing manager, and other exciting roles in the sports industry. You'll be able to tap into SNHU's network of graduates working in sports-related organizations. You'll also have the opportunity to take advantage of an internship or an experiential learning course within the field. Your courses are taught by faculty with real-world experience, so you'll have opportunities to connect with people in the industry. And when you graduate, SNHU will be right there to help you with your job search. SNHU is accredited, nonprofit, and has radically affordable tuition. SNHU was voted one of the country's most innovative universities by U.S. News & World Report. Just go to snhu.edu/VOCFB. The link's also in my description section down below to see if you qualify for SNHU's sports management program. You might be eligible for financial aid or have existing college credits that could fast-track your degree at SNHU. Click the link to get started. Your exciting sports management degree at SNHU awaits you. Do it now.